As an airline passenger, you always assume that the pilots of your aircraft are taking safe decisions based on industry best practices as well as their own experience. But what happens if those two things start working against each other? Stay tuned. In the evening of December 31st, 2020, an Air France crew was getting ready to operate Flight 736 back from Brazzaville in the Republic of Congo to Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris. They had spent their layover in Congo and was now eager to get back home, especially since it was New Year's Eve, but also because the conditions in Congo were still a bit complicated in regards to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, and also due to widespread violence in parts of the country, which had led to several countries actually imposing travel restrictions there. This fact was likely in the back of the pilots' minds as they were going through their planning documents before the flight. They had several alternates available to them along the route, but would definitely prefer not to use them. The good news, though, was that the weather, both at their departure airport, along the route, and at their destination, looked fine for this time of year. And as they were looking through the NOTAMs, that's the documents provided to highlight any deficiencies in airports they might use, these looked reasonably good as well. There were, as always, some minor points highlighted, but those were mainly focused on the en route alternates, and as I mentioned, the pilots had no intentions of visiting one of them if they could avoid it. The flight time was planned to be quite long on this flight, so the flight crew had also been augmented with an extra pilot to enable some in-flight rest for them along the way. So once the pre-flight planning was completed, the three pilots decided on a final fuel of 45.5 tons and then headed over to their cabin crew colleagues to brief them about the flight. Like I mentioned before, this flight took place during the pandemic, so there were only 136 passengers booked, and that likely meant that the 8 cabin crew were expecting a quite relaxed flight home towards Paris. And it is also worth mentioning here that among those passengers there were 2 Air France maintenance technicians traveling home for the holidays. Anyway, since there was no significant weather expected along the route and nothing else out of the ordinary, the pilots soon finished their cabin crew briefing and together they all started proceeding out towards the aircraft. The captain was a very experienced 54-year-old with close to 12,400 hours of total time logged. He had started his career in the military before joining Air France in 2002, and he had then gotten his command on the Boeing 737, flying for Air France's subsidiary Transavia, where he stayed for about 4 years, before finally being transferred back to mainland Air France again. And he had started flying the Airbus A330 as a captain only about 8 months before this flight. This meant that although he had over 3,800 hours of total experience on that type, only 80 of those had been operated as a captain. The 2 first officers that he was going to fly with had very similar experience as the captain. Both of them had started off in the military, and the one who was going to start off in the right seat on this flight was 53 years old and had a total experience of 5,656 hours. This meant that he was pretty experienced overall, but only 550 of those hours had been flown on the Airbus A330. The relief pilot was 54 years old and had 4,800 hours in total. He was slightly more experienced on the Airbus A330 with 803 hours, but on top of that, he had also worked as a synthetic flight instructor or a simulator instructor on that same type for Airbus. But in any case, the absolutely most experienced on board was the senior purser, who was 57 years old and had amassed a staggering 16,400 hours across several different types. And her experience will soon become very apparent. As the crew walked out towards the gate, they could soon see their shiny Airbus A330 gleaming in the apron lights, waiting for them with all sorts of catering, baggage and fueling activity going on around it. It was 18 years old at the time of this flight, and it had recently gone through some heavy maintenance over in China, where among other things the engines had been removed and subsequently refitted again. Now, for this to make any kind of sense to you, and before we continue, it's important to explain a few things here about the Airbus A330 fuel system in general and this engine refitting procedure in particular. You see, the fuel system on the Airbus A330 is quite complex. It is made up by 2 tanks in each wing, plus a center fuel tank in the belly between the wings and something known as a trim tank in the aft horizontal stabilizer. Inside of the inner tanks on each wing, there are so-called collector cells, from where the fuel is drawn down through the main fuel hoses in the pylons and then into the engines. And that means that every time that the engine has to be removed, those main fuel hoses also has to be disconnected. The problem though was that the components used to reconnect those hoses were known to be really fiddly, hard to work with and prone to misalignment. Specifically, a part known as the flange had a tendency to not be seated correctly together with the other connection parts, and if this wasn't noticed when the fuel hose was then reconnected, well, then the bolts used to make sure that the part sealed correctly could be fastened to the correct torque value, only to later become completely loose when this flange would vibrate back into position again. But like I mentioned, this was a known problem, and Airbus had highlighted this issue in their aircraft maintenance manual already back in 2015. In fact, the original flanges had actually been replaced by an updated version, which was smaller and easier to fit in place. But it wasn't yet mandatory to replace all of them. Instead, the old flanges could continue to be used for as long as they were still in stock. Another thing that's worth understanding here is that since this aircraft is very big and the different fuel tanks are located in different parts of the aircraft, there's also quite a bit of tubing required. And obviously, it's super important to control exactly where the fuel is at any given time, especially during takeoff and landing, since several tons of fuel in, for example, the horizontal stabilizer will have a big impact on the aircraft's center of gravity. Because of that, the Airbus A330 is also equipped with something known as a Fuel Control and Monitoring Computer, or FCMC. And this one automatically transfers fuel between the different tanks depending on the phase of flight and how much fuel is being used. For example, the FCMC will start an automatic fuel transfer from the inner tanks to the trim tank in the tail whenever the aircraft climbs through flight level 255, and then it will do a similar but reverse transfer during the descent. It will also transfer fuel between the center and wing tanks on regular intervals, and all of this is happening without pilot input under normal circumstances. But one thing that is really important to understand here is that if the pilots for whatever reason would move the engine master switch to off for an engine, at any point this would close the fuel valves providing fuel to that effective engine, effectively removing the fuel completely from it. Remember that. In any case, this was definitely not something that these pilots were thinking about when they arrived to the aircraft and loaded up their pilot bags into the cockpit. During the walk out, they had decided that the first officer would be pilot flying to start with and the captain pilot monitoring. The captain would then be the first one to go for his rest once the aircraft was nicely established in the cruise, and the relief pilot would then take his place. Now, we don't know who did the walk around, either the captain or the relief pilot, but we do know that nothing out of the ordinary was noticed during that check. The aircraft looked perfectly fine outside, and this was also true for the technical log, which showed no open technical defects. So the pilots just continued setting up their aircraft for departure, whilst the cabin crew welcomed the passengers on board. Everything was running like clockwork, and as soon as everything was done, Air France Flight 736 requested pushback and soon began taxiing out for departure. All checklists were then completed as per standard operating procedures, and at time 21:13, the first officer moved the two thrust levers forward and the giant Airbus A330 started accelerating down the runway. But unbeknownst to the crew, something had now started happening inside of the left-hand engine, something that would soon make their lives much more difficult. The takeoff and initial climb were completed without the pilots noting anything out of the ordinary, and they soon received their clearance to climb to their final cruise level, flight level 380 or 38,000 feet. Now, since they only had 136 passengers on board, they were quite light and could therefore climb immediately up to this level, reaching it after only about 35 minutes of flight. And when they... This is so annoying. For a while now, I've been receiving these spam messages, robocalls and text, and initially I couldn't figure out why that was suddenly happening. As it turns out, much of these are driven by data brokers, companies that profit from selling personal information like our names, addresses, birthdays, and even our browsing histories. Now, they sell this to corporations, banks, and even cyber criminals, depending on who pays the most, and all of this is completely legal. unless you opt out of it. The problem is that you have to do that individually, with each and every one of these brokers, and there are a lot of them. But here is where today's sponsor, Incogni, comes in. Once I signed up to them, they started contacting all of these data brokers and forced them to remove all my data, and they will then continue to monitor their compliance for as long as I stay with them. When I connected to their dashboard, I was shocked to find out that my personal data was being sold by over 100 different companies. No wonder I was getting spammed. But Incogni's digital army are now taking care of all of that for me, and if you are interested in getting that same help, then go to incogni.com/pilot and use the code PILOT to get an awesome 60% discount on their annual plan. Thank you, Incogni. Now let's get back to the story. After the aircraft had leveled off at flight level 380, the captain started his routine cruise checks. This is something that the pilot monitoring normally does, and it includes filling in the flight plan, updating things like off-block and takeoff times, and also the first fuel check. This check is done by comparing the expected fuel used with the actual, through verifying how much fuel is left in all of the various tanks. And we then do these fuel checks whenever we pass certain waypoints, but at a minimum every 30 minutes throughout the flight. The reason we do these checks is to make sure that we catch any discrepancies early, so we can start dealing with them. Obviously, it's super important to keep track of our fuel usage to make sure that we can reach our destination with the required minimum margins available, but it's also important because any significant deviation from the planned fuel use could be an indication of an impending engine issue or a fuel leak. When the captain did this first check, he immediately noticed that there seemed to be around 1.4 tons of fuel missing. This was obviously not good, but it also didn't bother him too much at this point. You see, the top of climb fuel check can be notoriously unreliable, since the location of the top of climb often differs due to unexpected level-offs, reroutings and weather diversions. But in this case, they had received a straight climb without any issues, so that shouldn't really be the case. Instead, the captain thought that maybe the true fuel quantity was a bit higher if the aircraft was doing one of those fuel transfers, because when that happens, quite a big amount of the fuel can be hidden inside of the fuel lines as it's being transferred and moved between the tanks. So he wasn't very worried. Instead, he told his colleagues about the issue, asked them to monitor the fuel state closely, and then went back to the crew bunk to start his scheduled rest period. Now, if you think that it sounds a little bit strange that the captain reacted this way, I would tend to agree. A 1.4 ton discrepancy is quite big, and if it would actually turn out to be a problem, they would at this point be in a really good position to just turn back to Brazzaville to get the problem investigated instead of continuing to fly north. An Airbus A330 normally burns between 4 to 5 tons of fuel per hour, so that meant that they were now missing close to 15 minutes of fuel. But given his reaction, I am guessing that the captain had probably seen similar numbers before and had good reasons to be as calm as he was. And like I said, they really wanted to get home this evening. In any case, as it turned out, he wouldn't get to stay in the crew bunk for very long. Because when the captain had left, the two first officers started looking at the fuel situation, and they really didn't like what they were seeing. For every minute that went by, the difference between how much fuel they should have and what they actually had increased. But in order to call the captain back, they likely felt that they needed to have a really good case to present. At the same time as they were looking at this, they also used that time to start looking at the weather for their different en route alternates, which I think was an excellent idea. You see, the more valid information that we can collect, the easier the decision making will be in case a diversion will ultimately have to be made. But after about 20 minutes, the relief pilot finally called the captain back to the cockpit. At this point, they had lost about 2.1 tons of fuel, and on top of that, a fuel imbalance had started to form with about 400 kilos less in the left tanks compared to the right. Together, these two facts pointed to a possible fuel leak on the left engine, the number one side, and something now needed to be done. Here, first of all, it's important to point out that an aircraft like the Airbus A330 will easily be able to handle an imbalance of this size. In fact, the imbalance could get as high as 2,900 kilos without any detrimental handling characteristics, and even as high as 7,500 kilos if one of the inner tanks would be full. For a fuel imbalance by itself, there are special procedures to follow, which includes pumping fuel from one side to the other, but obviously we wouldn't want to do that if a fuel leak is suspected, since the very last thing that we want to do is to pump good fuel out through a huge gaping hole somewhere. So when the captain had settled back into the cockpit again, he was briefed by his two colleagues, and together they decided to start going through the fuel leak non-normal checklist from their quick reference handbook, or QRH. Now I know that at this point some of you might be asking yourself, QRH, but that's a paper checklist. I thought the Airbus A330 had an ECAM system with electronic checklists to follow in case something like this happened. And you would be 100% correct. But the thing is that certain problems can actually be identified quicker by humans than the aircraft systems themselves, and a fuel leak is one of those. The ECAM indeed had such a procedure, but it wouldn't be triggered until the situation had grown considerably worse. So to preempt that, the crew instead used their good old paper checklist. But as we will soon see, the use of this checklist would also come with a bit of bias from the crew, which would make this incident way more complicated. When the captain took up the fuel leak checklist, the very first point said "land ASAP", meaning that an immediate diversion was now required. But interestingly, the captain initially didn't pay this instruction much attention. Since they had waited so long with starting the checklist by letting the captain sleep back in the crew bunk for 20 minutes, they had already flown far enough away from their origin airport for it not to be an option anymore. So instead, they were now about 250 nautical miles away from Yaoundé Airport in Cameroon and 520 nautical miles away from N'Djamena Airport in Chad, which were both listed as suitable en route alternates. But the crew were slightly more familiar with N'Djamena Airport. The time was now 22:14, and as the crew continued to work through the checklist, it soon also instructed them to shut down the engine on the site associated with the suspected leak. And here, it's probably worth explaining a bit about what this checklist was trying to achieve. First of all, the reason it had started by telling the pilots to divert was because the aircraft could otherwise find itself running out of fuel, especially if the leak was identified out over an ocean or a desert. But crucially, a fuel leak can also represent a very significant fire hazard, depending on where the leak is located. An uncontrollable fire is probably the single worst emergency that can happen to an aircraft, so there were plenty of good reasons that this checklist was prioritizing a diversion. Secondly, the checklist was created to bring the crew through several steps designed to find out where the leak was actually located. And like I explained in the beginning, if an engine was shut down using the engine master switch, this would isolate the fuel from that engine. So if the leak stopped after the suspected engine was shut down, well then the fuel leak would be confirmed to be in that engine and it could be left alone. But if the leak would continue, well then that engine could possibly be restarted again. And here, the bias that I mentioned before now came into play. Because both the captain and his two colleagues felt that the QRH paper checklist was more of an indicative document and not as decisive as a similar instruction coming from an ECAM checklist. The captain did not want to shut down the engine, and he felt that it was his prerogative to decide on that, not the checklists. And on top of that, his colleagues agreed and also felt a strong hesitation against shutting down an engine. They had all gone through training scenarios in the simulator where they had practiced fuel leaks, and in those scenarios the leak had always been pre-briefed in the classroom and the actual exercise had been very focused on fuel preservation and the correct use of the checklist, not at all on the complexities of a real-life scenario. So the crew now looked at their situation and didn't see a problem with the fuel quantity. They were flying over Africa with several alternates nearby and plenty of fuel still available, even with this apparent leak. And to make things even worse, when the captain was reading through this checklist, it wasn't written anywhere that these steps were also important in order to avoid a fire hazard. So a part of me actually understands why the captain chose to disregard first the instruction to immediately divert and then to shut down the left-hand engine. If he thought that this was only done in order to preserve fuel and for no other reason, well then it actually kind of made sense to wait. Remember, they were cruising at 38,000 feet when this happened, and the single-engine service ceiling of the Airbus A330 would likely have been closer to 26,000 feet with this weight, which meant that they would have had to immediately descend before shutting down the left engine, further limiting their options. As they were discussing this, the captain also added, well, if we choose to shut down the engine, this will be the start of something big, indicating that this was something that he really would prefer to avoid, and his two first officers seemed to initially agree. But here I want to make one thing very clear. The checklists and procedures that we are given are written in a certain way for a reason. They are created by some of the most knowledgeable and skilled people that the aircraft manufacturers have been able to muster, coming from all disciplines imaginable, including pilots, engineers, lawyers, and human factors experts. Those people have then been sat down in a room without any type of stress at all and tasked with finding the safest possible way of dealing with a potential problem, taking into account everything imaginable, including how their guidance will affect other systems, procedures and safety rules, but also, crucially, lessons learned from previous accidents and incidents. This is actually the reason we have so many procedures, because when the shit hits the fan, we pilots can then lean back on this enormous wealth of knowledge and ready-made decision-making, knowing that if we just follow these procedures, we will be covered in 99.9% of the cases. Now that doesn't mean that we shouldn't use our brains or experience. On the contrary, using these procedures should enable us to free up mental capacity to take the more overarching decisions that have to be taken, or to use our experience if the procedures or guidance doesn't end up solving the problem. In fact, this is exactly what, for example, EASA, the European Aviation Safety Agency, is also recommending in their guidance material, that the pilot should adapt when faced with situations where no guidance or procedures exist. But here, interestingly enough, Air France had decided to put their own spin on that guidance. In their manuals, they had instead written that pilots should improvise when faced with the unforeseeable to obtain the safest result. Do you see the small difference? EASA told its pilots to adapt after having used all procedures, whilst Air France told its pilots to improvise when faced with unforeseeable issues. It was later found that Air France might be encouraging their pilots to be a little bit too keen on improvising outside of established procedures, and that this could lead to the kind of circumstances that we're about to see. In any case, I am quite sure that if this crew would have been able to see what was actually going on inside of their left-hand engine, they would have been much more keen to follow the checklist. As I'm sure that some of you have already guessed by now, the main fuel hose had not been properly fitted after the aircraft's latest engine overhaul. But it had still stayed relatively tight for the preceding 6 flights before this flight, until this time when the flange had likely dropped into position, causing the bolts that were holding it to become much more loose, which then allowed the highly pressurized fuel to start spraying out through the connection. Now there was a drain mounted around the connection, which was supposed to divert small amounts of leakage away from the engine below and out through a drain mast, but it was not sized to deal with the enormous amount of fuel that was now gushing out. And this meant that this fuel now started flowing out over the several hundred degrees hot engine components below. So the fuel and heat part of the fire triangle was therefore complete. The only thing that was now needed was the correct amount of oxygen to make the fuel mixture perfect for combustion and a potentially catastrophic fire. But in the cockpit, the aircraft was still heading north at the same altitude. The captain had now asked the 2 maintenance technicians to join them in the cockpit, and together with the relief pilot, they had now gone back to over the wing in order to try and see if they could visually identify the leak. Unfortunately though, it was pitch black outside, so they couldn't see anything. As they were in the back, the captain gathered some updated weather for Yaoundé, Libreville and N'Djamena, which all looked okay. And as soon as the relief pilot was back, they started going through something known as the 4-deck decision-making model to see what actions they should take. 4DEC is similar to my company's PIOC, which I talk about in my leadership courses, and it's an acronym used to give structure to decision making. It stands for factual information collect, options available, risks, decision take, execute the decision, and control or evaluation of the progress. This is an excellent way of dealing with exactly these types of complex situations where there are many possible options to choose from. But the problem here is that this type of model assumes that all applicable non-normal checklists have been completed correctly before this model is started. Because if that's not the case, well then the factual information, the very first part of 4DEC, cannot accurately be completed since not all facts are correct. In this case, for example, if the fuel leak checklist had been completed, they should already be flying single engine at a lower altitude with the fuel leak sorted out. And since the checklist had clearly stated land ASAP, they should already be rechecking NOTAMs and weather for Yaoundé Airport, which was now the closest alternate, and also had a nice 3,400 meter long runway available. But here, as the captain was going through 4DEC, he analyzed the different options and risks as he saw them, and concluded that they indeed had a fuel leak, but that they also had enough fuel to choose a diversion option that they wanted. And the biggest risk, in his opinion, was not the leak, but instead that they would have to end up shutting down one engine and divert single engine. The time was now 22:26, 12 minutes after the fuel leak procedure had started, and still the aircraft was heading due north along the route. The pilots now started discussing whether to divert to Yaoundé or N'Djamena, and all three pilots thought that N'Djamena had better facilities, and those included some military presence close to the airport, which they felt could be good for security, keeping in mind here that these were very complicated times in the region that they were flying over. But there was no question that Yaoundé was closer and also had reasonably good weather with a nice ILS approach and a long, nice runway available for them. Now the captain pointed out that they hadn't finished 4DEC yet and therefore could continue heading north whilst they were completing this, and that would get them closer to N'Djamena anyway, basically pushing his own agenda. Again, if they had understood the enormous fire hazard that they were facing, they would have likely acted differently here, but that wasn't the case. At time 22:32, the crew contacted the Air France Operations Control Center, advising of the situation and that they were still debating which alternate to use. And they also indicated that they thought that maybe N'Djamena was more suitable from an operational perspective. The ops controller soon came back and told them that from their side there was nothing stopping them from diverting to N'Djamena, and so the decision was for all intents and purposes taken. But again, if 4DEC would have been properly done here, they would have noticed that there was actually more to this decision than they had thought of so far, but we'll get back to that soon. In any case, the captain now also pointed out that they had lost so much fuel that they wouldn't be able to continue to Paris anymore, showing that this had at least for a second appeared as a possibility in his head, but that it had now thankfully disappeared. He now also called in the lead purser to join them in the cockpit and informed her and the rest of the crew of the situation. And here something really interesting happened. You see, when the purser arrived, the captain briefed her about the fuel leak, and he also told her that there would be no need to prepare the cabin in any special way since they intended to make a normal landing in N'Djamena. But when the purser left the cockpit, she drew her own conclusion from what the captain had said and decided to prepare the cabin for a potential evacuation anyway. This is exactly the kind of thinking outside of the box which exemplifies someone with a lot of experience. She knew that she had some extra time on her hands before the landing and decided to use that time to at least be prepared if this fuel leak would turn into something much worse. And if it didn't, well then, no real damage done. Great stuff. As the aircraft was now getting further and further north, they soon passed the point of equal time between Yaoundé and N'Djamena, so N'Djamena was now both the closest and the preferred alternate for the crew. The captain continued expressing his opinion that they should keep both engines running for as long as possible, and that they should only consider shutting the left engine down if the fuel quantity in the associated tank would drop below 5,000 kilos. The reasoning behind that was to avoid any sudden unplanned shutdown due to fuel starvation on short final, for example. He then concluded the foredeck discussion with a formal decision to divert to N'Djamena and anchored that decision with his two colleagues. But I'm not sure if you've picked up on a small but interesting theme in this crew's decision making so far. You see, the idea behind foredeck, or any other similar model, is to try and facilitate the best possible decisions based on everyone's inputs, their experience and available facts. But this discussion had so far been very much driven by the captain, who had both asked the questions and then provided the answers. The other two pilots had willingly agreed with his reasoning, which indeed sounded very logical and well thought through, but that's not really the point. When I instruct people on how to use our decision-making model, PIOSI, I always tell the leader of the group to let the least experienced person in the room share their opinions first. That way, they can describe how they perceive the threat, and it allows them to form their own opinion untainted by the bias that can come from hearing someone with more experience talk first. Now, this doesn't mean that they will always come up with the best answers, but not so rarely they will actually bring up something that the rest of the group hadn't thought of, and that can have a profound effect on the rest of the discussion. If we look at this situation as an example, the captain did very clearly voice his opinion about not immediately wanting to divert or shutting down the engine, and both of the first officers agreed. But it would have been really interesting to hear what, for example, the relief pilot would have said if he would have been given the chance to talk first, given that he was an ex-simulator instructor on the Airbus A330. In any case, the captain now contacted the N'Djamena area controller and informed him about the situation. They also declared a mayday and requested a diversion down towards the N'Djamena airport, which was immediately facilitated by the controller. The aircraft started to descend, and just as they did, an ECAM message saying "Fuel F used, FOB disagree" appeared in front of the pilots. This meant that now even the aircraft's internal systems had identified the fuel leak and therefore referred the crew to complete the internal ECAM fuel leak procedure. Now, remember how I said before that the pilots felt that the QRH checklist contained more soft guidance than the ECAM checklist did? Well, given that, you would think that when the crew was now specifically told to do the same thing, namely to shut the affected engine down by the ECAM, that they would do it. But curiously, that didn't happen. Instead, the captain just deleted the ECAM page, and since a new status message didn't appear, he took that as a confirmation that the procedure had already been completed following the QRH checklist. It's funny how powerful self-reinforcement can be. But now the relief pilot finally chimed up and wanted to confirm when the number 1 engine was actually going to be shut down, just so that they all agreed. The fact that he did that would indicate that he at least was getting a little bit uneasy with the fact that the engine was still running. But again, the captain reiterated his view that he preferred keeping the engine running for as long as they had fuel for it, and at this point they also received the latest weather for N'Djamena, which indicated that runway 05 was in use with only some light winds on the ground. But the controller also informed them that the instrument landing system, the ILS approach, was not going to be available for them. The captain asked him to confirm that, and when he did, the relief pilot took up the NOTAMs and realized that there was work in progress close to the threshold of runway 05. So not only was the ILS out, the runway had also been shortened down significantly, meaning that the landing distance was now only 2,410 meters. The relief pilot did a calculation which indicated that they would still be able to land runway 05, even without the use of thrust reversers, which the QRH checklist had forbid them from using. But he also pointed out that the GPS-based RMP approach, which the crew were now planning to use, could potentially cause them some serious problems. You see, the RMP approach was constructed with the original threshold in mind, and since the new landing threshold would be over 400 meters further in, it meant that if they flew that approach, they might have to adjust their approach angle quite abruptly once they broke through the clouds and could see the runway. The relief pilot said that he had done something very similar at a different airport a few months earlier and that it had been very uncomfortable. He therefore suggested that they should use runway 23 instead. The captain took this into consideration, and since the wind on the ground was quite light, he agreed that they should switch over and land on runway 23 with some light tailwind instead. Now, these are exactly the kind of things and problems that you might find yourself in if you don't take the time to properly gather all the facts while running foredeck. Or if you let your personal preferences get in the way of objective decision making. If they would have taken the time to read through the NOTAMs before deciding on N'Djamena as their alternate, this would have likely changed their minds. But having said that, it's also obvious here that this captain actually did both listen and appreciate the opinions of his colleagues. That's why he decided to change over to the opposite runway when the relief pilot suggested it. Now, unfortunately, runway 23 had another, more hidden problem, something that was actually highlighted in the Air France route manual, and that was a tendency for a very strong tailwind on approach during this time of year. And that could happen even when the winds on the ground were reported as very light. Now, the captain did mention this as a possible threat, but not how much of a threat it would actually be. Instead, he started talking about the taxi phase, and that he wanted to keep the left engine running until they had vacated the runway. As they continued their descent, the captain soon took over the controls in order to allow the first officer to start giving his approach briefing. And while the first officer was preparing for that, one of the maintenance engineers came back into the cockpit and informed the captain that there was now a visible streak of fuel running under the cowling of the engine number 1 exhaust nozzle. The captain thanked him for this information, but also said that this would not change their action plan. Again, showing that he just didn't fully appreciate the danger of this fuel leak, which was now confirmed to come from the engine. So why am I going on and on about that? Well, there have been previous instances of fuel leaks being disregarded, which has led to in-flight fires. Back in May of 2013, an Airbus A319 had suffered an engine fuel leak after departure from an airport in the UK, and the crew did identify the leak, but then decided not to shut the engine down. And as they started approaching Heathrow, they also started extending flaps, and this caused a change in the airflow around the engine, which allowed the fuel mixture to become just right, and a violent fire ignited. Now, the crew in this case responded by following the engine fire checklist and shut the engine down, something that this captain had also said that he would do in case a fire would happen, but they were unable to get it under control until after they had successfully landed and the firefighters could extinguish it. Now, there have been plenty of other examples as well, so the point that I want to make here is that the chance of a fuel leak-induced fire increases a lot as the aircraft descends and starts configuring. Basically, any changes to the airflow inside of the engine or around the leak can be enough to get a fire started. And this was actually the reason that they weren't allowed to use the thrust reversers with a fuel leak. Now, the first officer went through his approach briefing, and at the end, the pilots discussed how they perceived the threats associated with the approach. The first officer pointed out that, according to him, the biggest threat was a possible fire on the ground, showing that the risk of a fire connected to a leak was definitely in his mind. But again, the captain reinforced that his greatest threat was that they would have to shut an engine down during the approach, and that this might lead to a single engine go-around and possibly some further holding. Now, after that, he said that it was actually up to the first officer, since he was pilot flying, if he wanted to shut the engine down before the approach. But he then almost immediately restated that their decision was to keep the engine running. Again, kind of asking a question and then answering it himself. The relief pilot now chimed in and reminded everyone that they couldn't use reverses after landing, and the first officer asked him to please remind him of that after landing in case he would forget. To that, the captain added, well, worst case scenario, you can just go to idle reverse, since that's not even reverse thrust, which the relief pilot agreed with. But that just showed again that they didn't really understand why the procedure was written this way. Activating the reversers, even without using much reverse thrust, would still alter the airflow inside of the engine and therefore increase the likelihood of a fire igniting. But I have to say that this could certainly have been better explained in the checklist. They were now getting closer to the airport and therefore started preparing the aircraft for the approach. As they were doing that, they were soon handed over to the N'Djamena approach controller, and at time 23:18, another ECAM warning appeared, this time for fuel imbalance. This once again pointed the crew to the fuel leak checklist and the need to shut the number 1 engine down. And this time, the captain looked through the action items, but again questioned the danger of keeping their engine running. Here he also said that the checklist didn't specifically tell him to shut it down, even though that's exactly what it did, and he also pointed out that there was no mentioning of fire in there. Now that was correct, but this comment indicates that he maybe now started to have some doubts about what was going on. At this point, the relief pilot now spoke up as well and said that he didn't think that shutting down the engine was such a bad idea. But then he quickly followed that up by saying that it wasn't a bad idea to keep it running for the moment either, since they were in the air and there was no emergency. All of this is indicative of something known as groupthink, where the desire for harmony and conformity inside of a group becomes more important than individual differing opinions and therefore leads to flawed decision making. It's really interesting to see this play out, and for anyone out there who's watching and to think that this is really interesting, these are exactly the kind of CRM principles that I love discussing during my live hangouts with my Patreons. If you want to join in the next one, check out patreon.com/join/mentorpilot, and I would love to see you there. Anyway, as they were now descending, the captain soon mentioned that his intention was to shut the engine down at the end of the landing roll and before turning the aircraft around on the turn pad at the end of the runway. But he later clarified that he would base his decision regarding when to shut the engine down on what the firefighters would tell him on the ground. He also started talking about the risk of a fire if the fuel would continue to leak out onto the hot brakes situated just behind the left engine, especially since he now started to realize that they would have to brake quite hard without reverses in order to stop on the relatively short runway. So he asked the first officer to modulate the brakes, meaning to basically pump them gently during the landing, but that obviously wouldn't help since the brake energy would still have to go somewhere, and pumping would only mean harder braking during each pump. Now, I just want to point out here once again that had the checklist been executed correctly, they both wouldn't have a fuel leak anymore since the engine would have been shut down, and they would have most likely have been diverting to an almost 1,000 meter longer runway, where this braking issue would not have really existed. At time 23:28, 1 hour and 14 minutes after they had started the fuel leak procedure and with fuel still gushing out to their left-hand engine, the crew was now cleared for the RMP approach for runway 23. At this point, they started slowing the aircraft down and configuring it for landing. And they had also decided to use flaps 3 instead of full flaps, just in case the engine would fail during the approach and they would have to do a single engine go-around. Now this was a great idea, but it would have been even better if they would have actually briefed how to do that single engine go-around, since if that would happen, it could quickly get messy. And I mean really messy. And another thing to take into account is, of course, with not flying with full flaps meant that they were now also using a higher approach speed, which would require a longer landing distance. Anyway, soon the aircraft was fully ready for the landing, with both the approach and landing checklist completed, and the aircraft started descending down the RMP glide path. But the pilots quickly noticed that they were struggling to maintain their approach speed because of a 32 knot strong tailwind that was pushing them forward. This was not what they wanted to see, since they knew that the runway was quite short and that they therefore couldn't take almost any excess speed into the landing roll. It's also worth pointing out here that a later calculation based on their weight, temperature, flap setting and speed would show that they needed a landing distance of 2,501 meter, 91 meters more than they actually had available. Now that calculation had a 1.67 safety factor in it, something that we always use for normal landing calculations, and they would definitely need that. Now the Airbus have several clever safety systems built into it, and one of them is something known as the Runway Overrun Warning, Runway Overrun Prevention System, or ROWROPS. This system will continuously and in real time calculate the aircraft's required landing distance and issue a warning if it feels that this distance would fall outside of the available landing distance, including a 15% margin. In the air, that warning would be both a visual and oral runway too short, which should then trigger a go-around. And if it happened on the ground, the warning would say max braking, max reverse. So as they were now hurtling down towards this relatively short runway, why wasn't this system warning them? Well, remember that NOTAM about runway works that we talked about before? Yeah. The aircraft database had no idea that this was going on, so it thought that it had a full 400 meters more available than what they actually had. Now, the first officer did a good job of maintaining the aircraft stabilized during the last part of the approach, and soon the tailwind fell from 32 knots down to below 10. So at time 23:34, the aircraft finally touched down about 550 meters into the runway with a speed of 150 knots, which was about 8 knots above the approach reference speed. So almost immediately, the roll-up system started shouting out, "Brake! Max braking! Max braking!" as it had now recalculated the available distance and saw that it was decreasing fast. The first officer therefore disconnected the outer brake and gradually increased the brake pressure up to max, and this caused all of the aircraft's enormous kinetic energy to be transferred immediately into the brake discs, just behind the steady stream of jet fuel which was still pouring out onto the runway. The aircraft finally managed to slow down to an almost stop, just short of the runway end, and as they came to a stop, the brake temperatures had already risen to 300 degrees Celsius. The relief pilot now suggested that they should finally shut the left engine down, but the captain wanted to make a right-hand turn at the turn pad, and he wanted to use the then outboard left engine to do that. Now, the firefighters who had observed the landing at first didn't see the stream of fuel that was trailing behind the aircraft. And when the captain heard that, he understood it to be okay to increase the thrust over 40% N1 on the now fuel-soaked left-hand engine in order to facilitate the turn. But by some miracle, this still didn't ignite the fuel, and the investigators later theorized that the fuel concentration of the air inside of the engine was likely so high that it effectively hindered the ignition. The aircraft continued to taxi in, and once the turn was complete, the crew finally shut down the leaking left engine. By that point, there was still fuel gushing out through the drain mast, and the later calculations showed that the aircraft had lost about 5.3 tons of fuel during the flight and a further 400 kilos during the taxi in. When the aircraft reached the parking gate, the brake temperatures had risen to an astonishing 600 degrees, and because of that, the crew waited with the disembarkation until they were sure that an evacuation wouldn't be necessary and that the firefighters were in place. Those firefighters also started to douse the area under the left-hand engine with water, and that was probably to dilute and minimize the risk of the brakes igniting the fuel. So in the end, everyone on board this aircraft was safe, which of course was the most important thing. But I think that this was a brilliant example of just how complex and messy things can get if we pilots think that we can outsmart our checklists. The final report quickly determined that the cause of the fuel leak was that mismounted fuel hose connection between the engine and the pylon. And because of that, a recommendation was sent out to all Airbus A330 operators to change out that flange to a new and improved design as soon as possible. Airbus also rewrote the fuel leak curate checklist to really highlight the fire risk, and Air France issued a safety first bulletin, updated their pilot training guidance, introduced a new fuel leak exercise in the sim, and also recommended their pilots to actually follow SOPs. But the BEA still finished off their report with a very serious note to Air France, pointing out that this wasn't the first time that they had found Air France pilots to voluntarily not follow SOPs and checklists. Their very last sentence in the report said that the BEA therefore considers that Air France should put compliance with procedures back into the center of the company's safety culture, which is a pretty harsh statement coming from a national safety agency. Now, I hope that you have found this video fascinating, and if you did, please leave me a like and subscribe to the channel. But if you really liked it, and you want to see these videos before everyone else and even impact the content, then join my Patreon crew by going to patreon.com/join/mentorpilot. I would love to see you in my next Zoom hangout, and in fact I just finished a 2.5 hour long hangout last night, which was really great. Now, check out these videos next and have an absolutely fantastic day. Bye bye.